How's it going, everyone? It's Ken from Pixelated Thoughts. I just finished up the Visions of Mana demo, and I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. The footage you're seeing was captured on PS5. I was initially playing on PC, but ran into a number of performance issues, so I decided to switch to console, where it ended up running pretty well. If you happen to play this on Xbox Series X or S, please leave a comment and tell me how your experience was. To kick things off, I want to talk about exploration. I like the fact that the two available areas in the demo, the Rime Valley and the Fallow Steppe, were contrasts of one another, as the Rime Valley is a linear area that featured environmental puzzles and an obvious exit, while the Fallow Steppe was a semi-open area that players could move around freely in. If this is how the rest of Visions of Mana is going to play out in terms of its level design, I believe that at the minimum, players can expect a fairly diverse experience in terms of biomes, which would be something that fans of the series can enjoy, as the majority of Mana games will put you in new environments often. There were two options available for traversal in the demo, which came in the form of being on foot or with a mount. In the linear sections, you are on foot only, and I think movement speed here is fairly fast, which will allow you to move through these sections quickly. You'll also have access to a double jump, which is handy in getting to those hard to reach places where you'll find treasures or other secrets. In the open environments, you're going to gain access to a mount, and while your speed is increased, you'll lose the double jump, which, if you think about it, is kind of weird, because as you're navigating through this environment, you're going to see all these different items just strewn all about the place, and some of these really require a second jump to get to. So you'll have to dismount to get to those, and it's weird because it interrupts the flow of traversal, and that's primarily due to the fact that there are animations you have to sit through when you're calling your mount. Regardless of the environment you find yourself in, you're going to find elemental vessels, and these will help you traverse specific areas. And this is mostly going to be thought of as environmental puzzle solving. In the Rime Valley, the vessels you find will slow down time. They create platforms to allow you to cross the icy river. In the Fallow Steppe, you're going to come across elemental vessels in the form of updrafts, and these will carry you to greater heights so that you can access new locations. There was a bit of jank here because the first time it carried me over, I thought I had to kind of navigate myself up, but instead it just dropped me off to the same place, and then I had to go around and then double jump to this chest. There are also shrines that weren't available to interact with in the demo, and it looks like they will provide rewards or buffs for the player, and I was really kind of hoping that you could interact with at least one of those, because it would have further incentivized exploration. While I didn't have any issues with the Rime Valley section, as it was fairly straightforward, the Fallow Steppe felt somewhat empty in terms of content. There are enemies to fight, but because the shrines weren't available to the player, you could only really engage in the one side quest that was available, which ended up just being a kill quest. And this also really gave you a taste of the side quests that were available in the demo, and those ended up being kill quests. And there was also one fetch quest, which, if you are looking for some type of unique side content, you're probably not going to find that in the demo, and I really think that was a missed opportunity by Square Enix to kind of showcase to the player that it's just not all combat. Because while I enjoyed the environmental diversity, I was hoping that the game was going to open up just a bit in the demo, because you're just intentionally preventing the player from seeing what's available. And the thing is, and it was probably the most curious thing, with the mount, you can just kind of run past or through enemies until you get all the way to the town. I really felt like exploration in the demo was a mixed bag, and I really feel like there's potential here. I'm really hoping that when you get to the different biomes, when you get to all these different environments, that we change up what your mount is, and maybe we mix it up a bit in the linear areas as well. I'm really hoping there's nice diversity here to kind of really engage the player. Now, when it comes to combat, I think this is where I felt the demo did a really good job of showcasing what the player could expect with the full release, but I do feel like it had issues in regard to its lock-on camera. Combat is similar to Trials of Mana, but with a few new additions. Now, I think that anyone who looks at the combat and thinks to themselves that this is similar to the Tales series, you're not wrong, but I do feel it's not as fluid, and I'll explain why. Here in Visions of Mana, you're going to have access to a normal attack. This can also be charged, which will then alter the attack. a special attack which will differ depending on the class the character is currently using, elemental vessels which can have varying effects, some will do damage, others can stop time, and lastly class strike attacks which can only be executed when your CS gauge is full. Think of them as ultimate abilities. While visually it is similar to the Tales series and the colorful art style will remind players of Tales of Arise, there is less character synergy here, at least in the demo. There are no options to conduct follow-ups with different characters. So the thing is, in Tales of Arise, it was really about team synergy, being able to build up that team meter and then switch to those different characters to do maximum damage. And that's not the case here. Combat is far more deliberate. Here, you are targeting the weaknesses on enemies, and if you fail to do so, if you're just button mashing, you can elongate the fight. So if you're not careful and you just happen to button mash in some fights, they can become resource intensive and you're going to learn really quickly why you should target weaknesses. Now, just like previous titles and just like the Tales series, you can switch characters by pressing the D-pad. For me, it was a bit clunky. It felt unintuitive because I was not able to cycle through characters quickly. When I pressed up and got to that next character, it felt like there was a bit of a delay to switch to the next character. And when you're in combat and you're trying to utilize other abilities and really trying to maximize your control in the game, it's a bit odd that that delay existed and it felt like it slowed down combat. And I'm just thinking that it's more than likely a problem with the demo. I'm really hoping that gets fixed. I actually enjoyed combat. I feel like when things flow, it can be pretty fun tearing through enemies, even though I feel like there's a lack of impact when you're striking. It's clear that with the different classes and weapons available that the play styles of the characters will change, and that's really cool to me. But if I'm hitting an enemy with a greatsword, I expect there to be weight. But instead, I feel like I'm hitting them with daggers or some small other weapon. It would be a nice detail for me to hit an enemy with a greatsword and knock them clear across the area. While that's just a personal gripe of mine, the real issue with combat that I found when I was playing through the demo was the lock-on camera. Now, in these types of action RPGs, I usually don't lock on if I'm facing multiple enemies. I would rather freely rotate my camera so that I can line up attacks. I'll generally only use the lock-on if I'm trying to focus on an elite enemy or a boss. The problem here is that the lock-on camera is serviceable at best and an issue for the player at worst. What frustrates me is that when you lock on to enemies, instead of the camera swiveling for the player so that you can line up your attacks, the camera just kind of sits there following the action. You cannot flick the right stick, as doing so will immediately move the camera to other enemies. So the best course of action is to lock on, then lock off so that you can freely move the camera. This isn't a good solution because the lock-on camera should swivel behind the player so that if an enemy jumps or moves or shifts positions quickly, you can track them. What I found really interesting was that if a locked-on enemy gets too far from you, let's say they just kind of teleport out of position or they just dash away from you for whatever reason because they're not targeting you, the camera may decide to zoom out as far as possible, which to me is an odd decision, and I'm trying to be as nice as possible about this. The first time this happened, I was confused because I thought it was my fault. I thought I was controlling the camera zoom by moving the right thumbstick, but then I found out that that wasn't the case. The game decided to do this on its own because it had difficulty tracking. The other thing that I found really fascinating is that when you're facing multiple enemies and you kill the enemy you are locked onto, you might run the risk of the camera zooming out to highlight that next available target if your team is fighting an enemy on the opposite end of you. I don't know about anyone else, but when I kill an enemy when I've locked onto them, I just want the lock on to end. So when I saw that this had happened multiple times, I decided to go into the settings to see if I had set something up wrong, but everything was at its default and I made sure that the zoom was at the medium setting. None of this should have been a problem. The camera became my enemy in these fights, so I decided that I would rather stick with free cam when facing multiple enemies so I don't run the risk of the camera just randomly zooming out. It was the only problem I really ran into when it came to combat in this game. And I had a really good time with this because there's a boss fight that's available in the demo that was really fun and surprisingly cinematic. It was just a really good time seeing how you were going through all these different phases. You had a little bullet hell phase, you had different swipes you had to move out of the way of. I was really having a good time until, you know, the boss had to summon mobs and then the camera just kind of went wonky for a bit. I just feel like it's the one thing that shouldn't happen because most of these fights are taking place in open environments. I could totally understand having camera issues if I was in a closed off space and I was dueling. But that's not the case here. Most of the environments you're in are wide open. But the camera, for whatever reason, decides to zoom all the way back when you target and lock on. And the weird thing is, it would be at random times when it would happen. So I just kept going into fights expecting the camera to mess up. Even though there were times it just didn't do anything, it was just really frustrating at the fact that the camera just didn't follow me the entire time. I'm hoping that it gets fixed before the full release, because otherwise, I really enjoyed the combat and I think it was the best part of the demo. So I was going to talk about the side quests before I ended the video, and I was going to talk about my time within the town, but I'm going to be honest. I don't think the side quests were particularly engaging, and I don't believe they added anything of value. I'm hoping that changes as the game progresses, because RPGs have evolved to the point where side quests can be engaging and in-depth, and sometimes they can really challenge the emotional impact of the main narrative. But here, they just didn't really add any real value. It was like, hey man, can you go kill this enemy for me? Sure. Can you pick up this hairpin? Sure. I just headed there and that was it. Luckily, fast travel is really simple and easy to use, and it's pretty quick. And in regard to the town, it was just, you know, nice to look at, but wasn't really interactive. There were areas that you could go to explore, and for some reason, by the way, this is like the weirdest thing. You can't double jump into town even though you have to get to these rooftops to get specific environmental items like the grizzly syrup. And you want to turn that in because it's another form of currency that can get you items that can buff your stats. I thought that was weird because I kept trying to jump around and I'm like, am I not double jumping in the town? That makes no sense. I'm not affecting anything. I'm just trying to get to these hard to reach areas, and now you've just made them harder to get to. You can still sprint and stuff, and that's cool, but not being able to double jump just made no sense. And also, there's not much to do in the town. It's really just nice to look at. By the way, visuals in this game look really good. Some of the faces, kind of weird. Some of the facial expressions, or lack thereof, it can be kind of haunting seeing how big their eyes are and them not making like any real expression when they're saying stuff to you, especially when they face the camera during these moments of dialogue. So just a heads up. With that rant out of the way, I still think that Visions of Mana has a lot of potential. And I'm not trying to say that as a fan of the franchise. I've been playing this franchise for a long time, and I'm hoping that Visions of Mana is at least as good as Trials. One of the things that I'm really curious about that has really caught my eye, and it's one of the reasons why I believe that this game has such high potential, is the way that they've tied classes to the different elementals you find. And the reason why this is important is because I think there's like 8 elementals in total, and each of these are going to have their own different skill trees, which will drastically change the way a character is played, because each of these classes had different weapons, skills, outfits, and that's going to allow for greater flexibility for the player. It's also going to allow for greater flexibility when it comes to your team's makeup, and I think that's awesome as long as it's executed properly. And I believe the developers can do that. The other thing is, I think my concerns about exploration will be resolved when the full release comes out, because I think you'll have access to the different shrines. I think there's going to be hidden levels and secrets, because that's generally how a lot of the Mana games have worked. And I really feel like my only big concern is the side content. This is kind of a big change for this franchise, because we are essentially going from just a bunch of linear levels to wide open spaces. And if you're going to this really big change where you're going to have all these different side content and side quests for the player, you might as well kind of be in depth with them, because it's going to be really noticeable because that's the content that's going to fill the gap when you are jumping from narrative point to major narrative point. So I think that if you don't have that fleshed out, it's going to become noticeable because a lot of people will say, well, you don't want to rush through the game, you want to see everything. But if there's nothing to see, why can't I just rush toward the end? And I think that really devalues the game a bit. But let's say the side content remains simple and basic. I think that the dev team can really make up for that by having a stronger narrative than usual. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to break the bank here and really change the way we should look at Trials of Mana. And I think that if you're hopeful, I think fans should look at it as like, if you remember when the Tales series was getting kind of stagnant and then Berseria came out and it got really dark and you were like, this is different. I think Visions actually has the room for that because you have this really hint of a relationship between the main characters, and there's narration found there that gives depth to these characters as they go on their journey, especially because they talk about what feels like darker elements, like the different sacrifices for the mana tree, all this type of stuff, and how maybe they could change that. Now, I'm not saying it's going to go full on dark and grounded, but I feel like if they just kind of add that here, it can be really impactful and really make up for that basic side content. So I'm really hoping that the narrative found here is a bit more complex because I am now curious after playing the demo where this adventure is going to lead to. Now, it could all blow up in my face, but I'm just saying the potential is there. But let me know what you think about the demo in the comments because that's going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken for Pixelated Thoughts. I'll talk to you next time.